In her televised statement, Ariel Bombara was clear about what she believed to be her father's intent.
What my father did was an act of domestic violence.
Just a month ago, I stood alongside thousands of others in the heart of Perth and listened to stories of violence, of pain and suffering and grief. Emotions inflicted on families by men. Men who had taken lives of the women they were supposed to have loved. 27 days later, last Friday, Mark Bombara left his multi-million-dollar home and travelled to Floreat, the wealthy, leafy suburb situated just 15 minutes away from where that rally was held. Bombara was looking for his estranged wife. He found her best friend, Jennifer Patelchik, and her 18-year-old daughter, Gretel.
Good evening. It was the domestic violence attack that shocked so many Australians. The shooting deaths of two innocent women in Perth late last week.
And after a terrifying 10 minutes, Mark Bombara shot the mother and her daughter dead with a gun he legally owned before shooting himself. Senseless, entitled, brutal, cruel, cowardly, and, according to his daughter Ariel, preventable. Because after days of bluster from political and police leaders, she cut through with such clarity that it made the state stop and listen.
If we would be able to take out a 72-hour temporary protective order, we were told no, and that there was nothing police could do about the situation at the time.
Unfortunately, for many victims, that is the brutal, harrowing truth. The Bombara women are not alone. On Monday, in a court in Perth, a man jailed for life for killing an elderly woman he was being paid to care for in a nursing home. And on Tuesday, 23 years in prison for a man who stalked a doctor and then tried to kill her with an axe because she had reported his incessant stalking. Joining me to try and join the dots as to why men's violence towards women keeps happening and seemingly keeps getting worse is family law advocate Nicola Jansen from O'Sullivan Davis Lawyers. Nicola, thanks for joining us on Caught in the Act this week.
Thanks very much for having me, Tim.
On any measure, it's been a traumatic week for so many people in Perth and beyond. I mean, what have you made of it all?
I mean, you've already alluded to the fact that it seems as though it's never ending at the moment. Every time we think we're making some headway and there's been a response from government, there's another murder or another assault or an increase in the instances of domestic violence being reported. So it's a bit overwhelming at times. It does feel at times like there's a bit of a losing battle going on, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think that what we know now is that family violence, which was once existed only in the shadows behind closed doors, is now squarely being put in the spotlight. Women are feeling, perhaps confident is the wrong word, but they are more willing to come forward to report the behaviour that they have been subjected to. And I think that that is a really positive thing.
And in your professional life, you obviously deal with family law, which, you know, crosses over into difficult emotional spaces. But when you first heard of what had happened in Floreat and the circumstances, I mean, I think everyone was shocked when we realised what had led up to this particularly heinous act.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, as a family lawyer, and Perth is quite a small profession, so I think it's fair to say that most of us know each other. The thought is always, oh my gosh, is this one of mine? And I know that I had that thought. I know that many of my colleagues at other firms had that thought as well. And as more details became available unfortunately, the lawyers that may have been involved, that became a reality for them.
And those details, of course, are harrowing. Jen Patelchik was one of life's givers. Basketball, water polo, the church on her street. She'd even bought a defibrillator for her own home for anyone who might need it as they were walking by. Her daughter Gretel, bright, pretty, liked, intelligent, a life of hope and promise on the horizon. There had been sadness, their husband and father John succumbing to cancer in 2019. But community had helped them in their days of need, and they were always there to help. Which is what they did when their close friend, Rowena Bombara, needed them. She needed somewhere to stay after her marriage to her husband collapsed. That happened over Easter weekend this year, with police called to watch over the house as she collected some things, including clothes, some of which had been left strewn across the normally pristine driveway. And then she went to stay with her friend, but was not there when Bombara turned up, armed, last Friday. The aftermath of what followed inside that tidy home with the frangipani in the front garden will forever scar so many people. Harrowing phone calls, pleadings for mercy, for sanity, a volley of gunshots, and then one more, heard by police who would rush to the scene. 3 dead, 2 women, and the 63-year-old millionaire gun nut from Mosman Park who had killed them. Nicola, the issues that have emanated out of this tragedy since Friday have been multiple, but at the heart of it all, of course, are, again, 2 innocent women, this time killed for no reason.
I mean, they were even further removed from the conflict compared to what we normally see. That certainly doesn't make it any better or worse. It's still a completely heinous act, but it is shocking that, they weren't the ones in a relationship with him. They were in the periphery of his life. From what I've read, he didn't really know them very well at all. And then I think that does make it a lot more shocking and more confronting, because to murder 2 people who you don't know in an act of rage is truly delusional, you would have to think.
You'd know much better than I, sort of working in this space, secondary victims of domestic violence situations and family law court situations are often sort of, they're not obviously the primary, they are secondary, but they are as affected, sometimes as the people right at the centre, the names on that court list or on that VRO.
I mean, especially the children, if the parties have children involved, chances are they've probably witnessed the violence, even if it's not the sort of traditional definition of family violence, i.e. physical violence. Children they're not silly and they're not stupid. They understand that something is not right. And unfortunately, one of the main problems with the pervasiveness of family violence is how witnessing that can impact on children as they grow up and their attitudes towards gender roles and adult relationships in general, to be honest. So they are the ones really that are the primary victims, in my opinion, other than, I'll say, the wife or the female partner, because we know that the stats are that female partners are infinitely more likely to be the victim survivors in cases of family violence, but children are certainly next on that hierarchy. And the problem with family violence and the attitudes towards it, and this is really a gender issue, is a lot of people still don't believe women. And when you see what women have to go through when they report family violence, you think, why on earth would anybody make this up? There is no benefit. If anything, it can make their life so much worse, having to deal with the fallout, the litigation, whether that be in the family court, the magistrates court, or one of the higher courts if there are criminal charges involved. And so it can really tear families apart, because some family members may simply choose not to believe the victim survivor. If there is a homicide or a murder at the apex, I suppose, of the behaviour, then it just leaves people asking why. And hindsight is a wonderful thing. there is a reason that people say, with the benefit of hindsight, why that is such a common thing for people to comment on. It's shocking. And I think people need to be a lot more aware of the indicators of family violence. There needs to be so much more education than there is now. In some of the media reports, and you mentioned it yourself, Tim, about the women living in Mosman Park and Floreat, respectively. I have seen some online criticism where the media has reported, the value of the properties, for example, which on the face of it is completely irrelevant. And I do think that the media could do better with making this link.
Yep.
But to give the media as a whole the benefit of the doubt, I think the point that these reporters are trying to make is that family violence occurs everywhere across the whole socioeconomic spectrum. It is not it's not a poor people problem. It is in my experience at least, it's very pervasive amongst higher wealth couples because of often they are the ones that can afford to have one person stay at home and take on the traditional gender role of the primary carer and one person working. And that can really fester a lot of resentment and disparity between the value of the contributions that each of those spouses is making. And that sort of attitude, in my experience, is what can then lead towards it amplifying towards coercive control and violence.
It's interesting. And obviously the details of the police response, I mean, that investigation will happen, and hopefully we'll hear some results of it. There's going to be an inquiry. But you just talked then about the children and being believed. Now, Ariel Bombara claims they were denied a temporary 72-hour police order. In reality, we know that there are many tens of thousands of those orders issued every year in Western Australia.
Yes.
So
Yeah,
in your
absolutely.
experience, in reality, I mean, those figures would suggest it is not that difficult to get that type of temporary protective order.
No, not at all. And look, I don't profess to know the complete details of the police response. So I want to be careful about assumptions. But in circumstances where the police accepted that there was at least enough of a concern to accompany Mrs. Bombara to her home to remove her personal items, where they saw her personal effects strewn all over the lawn. These are warning signs. If they saw that she was concerned enough to require police assistance to attend her own home, to get her own stuff, how on earth did she not meet the threshold for a 72-hour order? Because they are, I don't want to say they're easy to get, but they are made regularly just as a matter of course, because prevention is better than cure. And the purpose of that 72-hour order is to allow a victim survivor of DV to think about whether or not they do want to apply for a formal restraining order through the magistrate's court. So it's a placeholder, effectively. So it does beg a belief, based on what I know right at this moment, that order or that notice wasn't issued by the police.
Yeah. And as you say, the next step up is a restraining order, which you have to go to a court and ask for, and you give your circumstances before someone that will make that decision. But this week again, we've learned that family violence restraining orders are being breached in WA at the rate of 1 an hour. So that's thousands and thousands of breaches. And I see the court lists every day, and I see them all. I think I wrote there was 138 separate allegations of a breach of violence restraining order just this Monday. So those stats
outrageous.
Wouldn't give victims much, or survivors, or people involved in a domestic situation that is deteriorating. Those figures wouldn't give them much confidence, would they?
Well, and the thing is, Tim, these are just the breaches that are being reported.
Yeah.
I mean, what we need to understand is that a lot of, and again, I'm going to say women because it is women, a lot of women don't report breaches because in WA, as is the case with a number of other jurisdictions in Australia, if you are found guilty of 3 breaches on 3 separate occasions, it attracts a mandatory jail sentence of 2 years. And if you're a woman who is financially dependent or is not as financially independent as you need to be, particularly with the current costs of living issues that we're having at the moment, and you financially rely on that other person, you can't have them going to jail for 2 years, because where does that leave you and your children financially? You become destitute. So it becomes a situation where you're between a rock and a hard place, which is really unacceptable. But jumping back to the other issue of the breaches, and I want to take a step back to earlier on in the process, because in WA, even though the police have the power under the Restraining Orders Act to apply for a restraining order on behalf of a woman, they don't do it. And I don't know why, because in Queensland, particularly after the Clark murders, the police were applying for restraining orders left, right and centre. And that's really what they should be doing here, because a lot of the time, post-separation, it becomes a family law issue. So parties are already trying to navigate one legal system through the family court. A restraining order application occurs in the magistrate's court. So for people who are already suffering from trauma, potential PTSD issues, trying to deal with the incredible complexity of the family court.
And the expense.
So then, look, don't even get me started on the expense. But to then expect them to instigate another set of proceedings in a separate court that, if defended, will go to a separate trial, it's frankly ridiculous. So why aren't the police the ones who are utilising the power that they already have to apply for the restraining orders, and then they are the ones running that case, not the woman?
Would there be a reluctance by police to be seen to be sort of taking over in that, or making an order against someone's will, or even if they're not, but the perception might be, well, you've just come out of one controlling relationship, and then the police want to sort of put an order in on your behalf, in inverted commas?
I'm sure that it's the same thing when police are considering whether to press charges for assault. The victim's input is crucial in whether they make that decision to prosecute. So I don't think it would be any different here, but surely it wouldn't be that difficult to just contact Queensland Police and ask for their collective experience in making those applications and dealing with victim survivors in that context. I don't think that that's a good enough excuse to just not do it. And
do you think there might be some police officers going back to the belief point that, well, if she's making this up and I go into court, then I'm gonna be so embarrassed in front of a magistrate?
Oh, look, probably the attitude of men in general, and I think especially police in the context of what they are dealing with on a daily basis, is something that also needs to be addressed. We've heard reports about systemic and cultural issues within the police, and this is not unique to the WA police by any means, where there are ingrained elements of misogyny is a strong word, but I think that's what it is. I've acted for a lot of women and men in my time, and I can tell you the number of men that I have had who have been served with a restraining order and then been told by the police, oh, she's overreacting, you don't need to worry about it, it just seems a bit over the top, instantly minimising the effect of that order. Are we then surprised that these breaches are happening? Are we then surprised that the police aren't being as proactive in this area as they otherwise could be?
In her televised statement, Ariel Bombara was clear about what she believed to be her father's intent.
What my father did was an act of domestic violence. My mother and I made it clear that lives were at risk, and we were repeatedly ignored.
What have you made of the political back and forth since last Friday? I mean, particularly the argument which erupted over, initially, whether this was a family violence incident at all.
Yeah, that was a bizarre...
That's a good word.
That was just a bizarre element to take up the front page, frankly. I think it's really odd that this wasn't immediately recognised as being family violence.
I think
And I saw
everyone
a
else
really-
recognised it was, though.
Oh,
I wasn't
absolutely.
sure whether it was a misspeak by the detective under massive pressure, or whether
Look,
they
and
were
quite
just,
possibly.
the letter of the law, as we say. But I mean,
Yeah,
it was clear
yeah.
to blind Freddie and probably all his blind mates that this was domestic.
Oh, look, absolutely. And I mean, the thing is that the definition of family violence is so broad that it also includes, and this is quite a crude comparison, but I want to make the point that harming a family pet is considered an act of family violence. So surely harming, or in this case, murdering the wife's best friend and her daughter, how is that not? I mean, that's an offence that is infinitely worse. And in the context of everything that was occurring around at that time, I mean, I would have thought that, as you say, it seems to everybody at the pub would have agreed that it was family violence,
And a key theme that has authorities, in fact everyone concerned, obviously in this case, is the use of firearms.
I specifically mentioned that there was a Glock handgun which was unaccounted for. My understanding is this ultimately would be one of the weapons that my father used to take the lives of 2 innocent women.
Nicola, gun laws, again, have obviously become an obvious topic since, but in the reading that I've done this week, the fact is that the use of a firearm in intimate violence scenarios have actually gone down in the last 20 years. But that doesn't make this incident less serious. But does it make the debate over guns, which is followed, a sidebar issue? Or
Yeah, look, in my opinion, yes. Because Ariel also made the point with her father that even if he didn't have the guns, he would have done it another way. And I think that is the case for a lot of these offenders. A gun is obviously the easiest tool to use because it removes some of that intimacy. All you need to do is pull a trigger. And so obviously gun reform is something that should be looked at, but it's certainly not the most important thing to take away from this, in my opinion. And I think that, as you said, Tim, the instances of guns being used in family violence situations has reduced. And I mean, the reasons for that are fairly obvious. I would have thought it's the heavy regulation in that area since the 1998 reforms after Port Arthur, and also the uptake of restraining orders and the introduction of family violence restraining orders. It would have been about 5 years ago now, I think, which recognise that much wider definition of family violence. And when you have a family violence restraining order, one of the terms is that all firearms must be surrendered to the police. And so it takes those out of the equation instantly.
But it would appear now that the police or the politicians or the powers that be are going to target the intersection of firearm ownership and family violence. Do you think they can be strengthened anymore, or if they can, how should that look? Do you think?
I mean, it can always be strengthened. I am certainly not an expert in the Firearms Act, so I don't want to delve too far into the specifics of that. But what I am very frustrated at is the constant knee-jerk reactions that we're getting. I mean, with the Labor government recently announcing $900 million worth of funding over 5 years to extend the Liberal government's program for women fleeing family violence situations. Okay, but you haven't funded any of the services that are required to support those women once they do leave. In fact, in the federal budget, you've only given them 30% of what they have said they need. And now to talk about, and I appreciate that there is a difference between the federal and the state governments on this issue, but to look at what has happened in Floreat and to then look at gun laws as the most pressing issue coming out of that is a fundamental mistake.
It struck me as just a magpie seeing a little glint in a nest and just swooping onto that rather than worrying about the fox on his tail.
That's right. And look, I understand they need to be seen as though they're doing something, but these issues aren't new. Can we just stop talking about them? Let's get rid of any more focus groups and any more committees and start doing something.